A cold night, a kind heart, and an unbelievable alien gift. The wind howled like a wounded beast, dragging icy claws across the landscape. Snow whipped through the night in violent spirals, swallowing everything in a thick, relentless blizzard. Julian Locke hunched his shoulders against the cold, his breath curling in white plumes as he trudged up the path to his cabin. His boots crunched against the frozen ground, each step a minor victory against nature's onslaught. He had lived alone in these woods for years, finding a kind of peace in the isolation, though he would never admit to the loneliness that sometimes gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. His world had become predictable. Chop would fix the truck that refused to die and nurse the same cup of coffee until it turned to sludge. A life of quiet monotony, which is why when he saw the figure standing in the middle of the road ahead, he assumed for a moment that his mind was playing tricks on him. The silhouette was motionless, barely visible through the veil of snow. Julian squinted, his pulse picking up speed. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one in their right mind would be out here at this hour in this weather. The only reason he was out himself was because his truck had stalled halfway home, leaving him to hike the rest of the way like some tragic figure from an old frontier story. Hey, he called out, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. The figure did not move. Julian's fingers twitched toward the knife at his belt. Not that he considered himself a violent man, but he liked to think he had enough sense to be cautious. His eyes swept over the stranger, noting the strange stillness in their posture, their head tilted slightly as if they had only just noticed him. Then they stepped forward. The firelight from his cabin flickered against their features, revealing something that sent a ripple of disbelief through him. The woman, because she was unmistakably a woman, had a face that was human in shape, but slightly too smooth, too symmetrical, as if she had been sculpted rather than born. Her skin was pale, but not in the way of someone suffering from the cold. It had a faint luminescence, a barely perceptible glow like moonlight captured in flesh. Most striking, however, were her ears, long and pointed like something out of an old fantasy novel. They twitched slightly as the wind changed direction. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a moment, all he could do was stare at her, his brain scrambling for an appropriate reaction. He said intelligently. The woman regarded him with large violet eyes that seemed too deep, as if they held entire galaxies within them. Then she took another step forward and stumbled. Julian moved on instinct, catching her before she collapsed into the snow. She was freezing, her body trembling violently against his. Okay, he muttered, not exactly the time for existential questions. Let's get you inside before we both freeze to death. She didn't resist as he wrapped an arm around her, supporting her weight as they made their way toward the cabin. She was light, almost unnaturally so, and when he glanced down, he saw that her feet were bare, the snow barely clinging to her skin. That was the moment Julian decided that whatever else was going on here, hallucination, alien encounter, some elaborate prank played by a very dedicated lunatic, he would deal with it. After getting her warm inside the cabin was blessedly warm, the fireplace casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Julian eased the woman onto the old couch, shoving a pile of blankets around her before crouching in front of the hearth to stoke the fire. He glanced at her over his shoulder. So, do you speak English? For a long moment, she simply watched him, those violet eyes unblinking. Then, as if waking from a trance, she parted her lips. Yes, she said, her voice soft, melodic. Julian exhaled in relief. That was at least one problem solved. Good, that saves us from a very weird game of charades. He sat back on his heels, studying her. You got a name? She hesitated. Lara. He tested the name on his tongue, then nodded. All right, Lara. You mind telling me what you were doing, standing in the middle of the road barefoot in the middle of a blizzard? She blinked slowly. My ship malfunctioned. Julian stared at her, then he let out a short, incredulous laugh. Your ship? Yes, as in a spaceship. She nodded, entirely serious. Julian ran a hand down his face. You know, I was kind of hopping you'd say cruise ship, or I meant to say car or something that didn't immediately make me question my grasp on reality. Liza tilted her head. Would it help if I lied? Not really, but I appreciate the consideration. He stood up, rubbing the back of his neck. There were two ways he could approach this situation. One, assume she was delirious from the cold and needed medical attention. Two, accept the increasingly Likely possibility that he had just invited an extraterrestrial into his home, and for some reason she liked to wander around during snowstorms. He chose the middle ground, make her comfortable, get some answers, and avoid making any calls to the authorities until he had at least one strong cup of coffee. Speaking of which, all right, well, I don't know what kind of fuel you run on, but I'm making hot chocolate. He glanced at Hiru. Not allergic to sugar or anything, right? Lara gave him a look of such profound confusion that he almost felt bad for asking. 20 minutes later, she was wrapped in blankets, cradling a steaming mug of hot chocolate between her hands. She took a careful sip, then her expression changed, her eyes widening, ears twitching. This, she whispered reverently, is the most incredible thing I have ever tasted. Julian smirked. Congratulations, you've just discovered humanity's greatest achievement. She took another sip, a small sigh of bliss escaping her lips. Your species is fascinating, Julian chuckled, leaning back against the armrest of his chair. Trust me, we baffle ourselves most days. He let the silence settle for a moment before adding, so spaceship Lyra nodded solemnly. It is stranded. He exhaled through his nose. Of course, it is. The fire crackled, filling the quiet between them. Julian took another look at her, at the way the light reflected off her skin, the way her ears twitched ever so slightly, the way she seemed at once alien and yet strangely human. Well, he said, stretching out his legs, guess I better start figuring out how to help you fix a spaceship. Lara tilted her head. You would help me? Julian shrugged. I mean, you seem pretty harmless. Besides, I need a reason to get out of the house. Lara considered this for a moment, then gave a small, almost playful smile. Then I shall repay you. Julian Locke. He raised a brow. Yeah, and what exactly does an alien give as a thank you gift? She only smiled wider. You'll see. Julian awoke to the distinct feeling that something was very wrong, not in the ominous gut clenching, oh no, the world is ending way, but in the quieter, more insidious way, like realizing you've overslept or forgotten an important appointment. The room was unnervingly still. The only sound was the crackle of dying embers in the fireplace, their glow casting restless shadows on the wooden walls. Then he noticed the smell. A sharp, acrid scent filled the air. Something burning, but not wood, more like plastic or maybe metal. Either way, nothing that should be burning in his cabin. He bolted upright, instantly awake. Lara, a metallic whir answered him from the kitchen. He turned his head and groaned there, hunched over his coffee maker like some kind of futuristic mechanic, was the alien woman he had invited into his home. The machine lay disassembled on the counter, its inner workings exposed in a tragic mess of wires and tiny screws. Lara, clad in one of his oversized flannel shirts, because apparently aliens also suffered from the universal experience of needing warm pajamas, was prodding at something inside the device with an expression of deep scientific fascination. Julian dragged a hand down his face. I was afraid of this. Lyra turned, her violet eyes gleaming with excitement. Did you know your liquid energy dispenser is built with terribly inefficient circuitry? My what? Julian stumbled out of bed and made his way toward her, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Lara gestured to the ruins of his coffee maker. This device, it takes an unnecessarily long time to process your caffeine supply. I am improving it. Julian groaned. Your what? No, don't improve it. I like it the way it is. Lara looked genuinely baffled. You prefer slow, inconsistent technology? Yes. Julian threw his arms up. Because at least when slow technology breaks, I have a fighting chance of fixing it. Lara pursed her lips, clearly unimpressed. That logic is deeply flawed. Julian looked mournfully at his coffee maker, now unrecognizable as anything other than electronic roadkill. Can you put it back together? Of course, she said confidently. I have retained all original components. Well, except for the one I vaporized. Julian made a strangled noise. You what? She waved a dismissive hand. Irrelevant. I replaced it with something superior. Julian rubbed his temples. It was too early for this. Okay, great, fantastic, but if this thing doesn't make coffee when you're done, I am launching you back into space myself. Lara only grinned. Noted. With that small crisis probably under control, Julian turned his attention to the bigger problem. The whole stranded spaceship situation. All right, you said your ship malfunctioned, he said, crossing his arms. I assume that means it didn't explode or anything. Lara gave him a flat look. I would not be here if it had. Fair point. He exhaled, glancing Outside snow still blanketed the world in thick unbroken drifts, but the storm had died down. How far from here is it? Elle's ears twitched slightly as if she were measuring the distance. A few miles eastward, near the river basin. It should be mostly intact. Julian frowned. Mostly. Lara hesitated. Some damage is to be expected. Julian ran a hand through his already messy hair. All right, well, I guess we should check on it before another blizzard decides to roll in. Lyra perked up. Excellent, I will retrieve my footwear. Julian blinked. Wait, you have shoes? Lyra looked mildly offended. Of course. Julian pointed at her feet. Then why were you wandering around barefoot in a snowstorm last night? She hesitated just a fraction. Too long. I misplaced them. You misplaced them. Lara cleared her throat. Shall we go? Julian narrowed his eyes. He didn't believe her for a second, but he let it slide. The walk to the crash site was an exercise in patience for one. Lara seemed completely unaffected by the cold, while Julian trudged through the snow in his thickest winter coat. She strode beside him as if they were taking a leisurely springtime stroll. When he pointed this out, she simply shrugged and said, my physiology is designed for environmental adaptability. Great, Julian grumbled. I trade my toes for that ability right about now. For another, she had the annoying habit of pausing every so often to analyze something completely mundane. At one point, she crouched beside a cluster of frozen mushrooms, studying them with deep concentration. Your planet's fungi possess an admirable resilience, Julian said, and we are absolutely going to freeze to death while you admire them. Lyra smirked. Your survival concerns are adorable. Julian shot her a withering glare, but it was hard to argue with someone who seemed impervious to both the elements and his frustration. Eventually, they reached a clearing where the snow had been disturbed by something large, something that had skidded violently before coming to a stop. Julian whistled. That looks like a crash landing. All right. In the center of the mess sat a sleek silver vessel half buried in snow. The ship was unlike anything Julian had ever seen, elegant, almost organic in shape, as if it had grown rather than been built. A faint blue glow pulsed from within the seams, casting an eerie light over the frost-covered wreckage. Lyra sighed, placing a hand on the hull. This is unfortunate. Julian raised an eyebrow. Unfortunate, as in I need duct tape, or unfortunate, as in we totally screwed? Lyra gave him a sharp look. The former, probably. Julian sighed. Great, so what's the plan? Lyra studied the damage. First, we must determine the extent of the malfunction. The external repairs will be simple enough, but the core systems may be more problematic. Julian crossed his arms. Define problematic. Lyra hesitated. If the core is frozen, we may require external energy to restart it. Julian exhaled. Of course, and where exactly do you suggest we get external energy? In the middle of nowhere. Lara tilted her head. Your civilization has power sources, does it not? Julian snorted. Yeah, let me just plug your spaceship into my generator and see if that works. Elle blinked. That might actually. No, Julian cut in. That was sarcasm. Lyra sighed. Unfortunate, we will have to find another method. Julian shook his head, looking at the ship. This was going to be a long day. Julian stared at the ship, hands on his hips, mentally tallying the number of ways today could go horribly wrong. If Lara's definition of simple external repairs was anything like her definition of minor coffee maker modifications, they were probably doomed. He stepped closer to the silver vessel, its surface smooth and oddly warm beneath his fingertips. Despite the frigid air, the ship's design made no sense. There were no visible seams, bolts, or anything resembling human engineering. It looked more like an enormous polished seashell than a machine capable of interstellar travel, so he said, turning to Lara. Where's the user manual? Lara gave him an unimpressed look. It is stored within the ship's data core. Great, Julian muttered, and where's that? She knelt by a section of the hull and pressed her palm against it. The metal rippled beneath her touch, shifting and reshaping itself like liquid silver until a small panel appeared. Julian took a step back. I'm going to pretend that doesn't freak me out. Lyra ignored him, focusing instead on the panel. It glowed softly beneath her fingertips, alien-esque, flickering across its surface. Then something inside the ship made a noise, a deep mechanical hum like a slumbering beast stirring in its sleep. Lara's expression darkened. That is not ideal. Julian's stomach tightened. That sounded like the opposite of fixed. Lazarus sighed. Standing up, the ship remains in emergency stasis. The core systems are locked due to critical damage. This means we will need an external power source. After all, Julian exhaled sharply. Right. Because nothing is ever easy, he gestured toward the ship. You sure there's no jump start button or something? Lara considered this. There is a fail-safe override. Fantastic, but it could also overload the ship's circuits and cause a containment failure. Julian dropped his head into his hands. Of course it could. Lizer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Do not worry, I will not attempt it unless we have no other options. Julian lifted his head. I feel like your definition of no other options is a lot looser than mine. Lyra smiled. You are learning. Back at the cabin, Julian sat at the kitchen table watching Lyra scavenged through his supplies with alarming efficiency. So what exactly are we looking for? He asked Lyra, who was now rifling through a drawer full of mismatched tools. Answered without turning. Conductive materials. Anything that can serve as a power bridge between an external energy source and my ship's core systems. Julian leaned back in his chair. I hate to break it to you, but my cabin is not exactly stocked with high-tech spaceship repair gear. Lara pulled out an old extension cord, studied it briefly, then tossed it aside. I have noticed your civilization's unfortunate dependence on primitive energy storage. Your power grid is incredibly inefficient. Julian raised an eyebrow. Yeah, well, excuse us for not having fancy self-repairing spaceships. Lara's ears twitched. If it helps, I find your technological limitations rather charming. That helps. 0%. She turned to face him, arms crossed. If we cannot find a suitable power source here, we will need to acquire one elsewhere. Julian frowned. You mean drive into town? Lyra nodded. Your commercial establishments likely contain useful components. I will need access to conductive wiring and energy regulator. And Julian held up a hand. Okay, slow down, Professor Space Wizard. Are we just going to walk into a hardware store and buy spaceship parts? Lyra blinked. That is the general idea. Yes, Julian sighed. Right, okay, and how exactly are we explaining this? Lara tilted her head. What do you mean? I mean, Julian said, rubbing his temples, that we can't just waltz into a store and ask for one spaceship jump starter. Please, people are going to ask questions if I start buying weird, expensive tech stuff. Lyra considered this for a moment, then she nodded. I see your concern. Glad to hear it. Luckily, she continued, I have a solution. Julian narrowed his eyes. I feel like I'm about to hate this. Lara clasped her hands together. You will pose as a researcher conducting an experiment in alternative energy sources. Julian stared at her. What? It is a perfectly reasonable cover story. She insisted. Your people have many scientific endeavors. We will simply claim that you are attempting to build a prototype for a new energy conversion device. Julian let out a short laugh. Yeah. There's just one problem with that. I am not a scientist. Lyra waved a hand dismissively. I will handle the technical explanations. You merely need to make the purchases. Julian shook his head. This is ridiculous. Lyra smiled. You have a better plan? Julian groaned. Fine, but if I get arrested for buying suspicious electronics, I am blaming you. Noted. The drive into town was blessedly uneventful until they actually arrived. The moment Julian pulled into the parking lot of the local hardware store, he realized two very important things. One, Lyra, despite her best efforts, did not look like an ordinary human. She was wearing his flannel coat, a scarf, and a beanie to cover her ears, but there was something about her posture, too precise, too poised, that made her stand out. Too, she had absolutely no concept of social subtlety inside the store. Julian did his best to act casual, gathering the things Lyra had requested, while she inspected everything with the wide-eyed curiosity of an undercover alien. Julian, she whispered, holding up a box of cards. Car batteries. These crude energy storage units may be of use. Julian hissed, glancing around. Lara lowered her voice. But these, I know what car batteries are. Just grab what we need and don't draw attention. Lara nodded solemnly. Then she immediately began scanning the shelves with what could only be described as intense scientific scrutiny. Julian sighed. This was going to be a long trip. At the checkout counter, the cashier, a burly man with an impressive mustache, gave Julian a slow once-over. Working on a project? Julian forced a grin. Yep, just a personal experiment. Alternative energy sources. Science-y stuff, the man squinted that so a Lara leaned in smiling. We are conducting research on experimental power transfer methods. Julian closed his eyes. Why does she talk like a mad scientist? The cashier gave them a long, skeptical look, then he shrugged and rang them up. Weirdest hobby I've heard of all week. That'll be $342. Julian winced. Science is expensive. As they left the store, Julian let out a relieved breath. Okay, that actually went smoother than I expected. Lyra nodded yes. Now we return and repair the ship. Julian sighed, staring at the pile of expensive gear in the back of his truck. You better have a good reward in mind for all this. Lyra smirked. You will not be disappointed. For some reason, Julian wasn't sure whether to feel excited or terrified. The truck rattled and bounced over the snow-packed road as Julian drove them back to the cabin, the back seat stuffed with batteries, copper wiring, and an assortment of questionable electronic components that probably looked suspicious to anyone who hadn't overheard their alternative energy experiment excuse. Lar sat in the passenger seat, hands neatly folded in her lap, looking as composed as ever despite the bumpy ride. The scarf wrapped around her head kept her long ears hidden, though every so often one would twitch beneath the fabric, causing a slight ripple. Julian tried not to find it amusing. You're enjoying this way too much, he muttered, keeping his eyes on the road. Lyra turned toward him, expression one of perfect innocence. Enjoying what? This, he gestured vaguely at the truck, the loaded supplies, and the absurdity of their situation, dragging me into a secret spaceship repair project, making me lie to hardware store cashiers, destroying my coffee maker. Lyra placed a hand over her heart in mock offense. I improved your coffee maker. You murdered my coffee maker. Lara tilted her head. Murder implies intent. That was merely an unfortunate recalibration accident. Julian sighed. All I'm saying is I hope whatever reward you're planning to give me is worth all this trouble. Lisa's lips curved into a mysterious smile. Oh, it will be. That was the part that made Julian nervous. They made it back to the cabin just as the last light of day faded behind the trees. The snow crunched under their boots as they unloaded the supplies, carrying everything inside before the cold could turn Julian's fingers into icicles. As he dropped the last box onto the kitchen table, he let out a long breath. All right, what's the plan? Because if you tell me I have to solder something, I need you to know that my experience with wiring begins and ends with plugging in a toaster. Lyra began sorting through the components with practiced efficiency. Do not worry, Julian, I will handle the modifications. Your task is simple. Julian leaned against the counter. Oh good, I like simple. Lisa returned to face him. You must provide snacks. Julian blinked. Come again. Liza gestured to the supplies. This process will take several hours. I require sustenance. Julian stared at her. You're telling me you're about to jury rig an alien spaceship back to life, and I'm the one on snack duty? Lara nodded. Correct. Julian sighed and opened the pantry. Fine, but I'm going to need a raise. Lyra worked with a level of precision that was almost hypnotic. She had cleared a section of the kitchen table, carefully stripping wires, splicing connections, and occasionally muttering in a language Julian didn't recognize. The alien symbols on the small device she'd brought from the ship glowed faintly, casting shifting patterns of blue light across the wooden surface. Julian sat nearby, chewing on a granola bar and watching her work, so he said after a moment, just out of curiosity, what happens if this doesn't work? Lyra didn't look up. Then we will have to attempt the manual core override. Julian frowned. You mean the one that might cause a containment failure? Lyra gave a nonchalant shrug. Yes. Julian took another bite of his granola bar. Cool. Love that for us. Lara smirked but said nothing. By the time Lara finished assembling the makeshift power relay, it was well past midnight. The soft hum of the device filled the cabin, a gentle but constant pulse of energy moving through the wire. Lara stood, stretching her arms above her head. It is ready. Julian yawned. Awesome. Do we test it here, or do we have to hike back to the ship? Lyra gave him a pointed look. Julian groaned. Hiking, of course. The snow had hardened under the night air, making the walk to the crash site slightly easier, but no less unpleasant. Julian's breath fogged in front of him as he trudged through the trees, following the faint blue glow of Lara's device as she carried it ahead of him. Really not cold, huh? He asked as they neared the ship. Lara glanced back Not particularly. My body adjusts to environmental shifts much more efficiently than yours, Julian shook his head. You know you could pretend to be cold, just for my dignity, Lara smirked. Would that make you feel better? Absolutely. She considered this for a moment, then let out an exaggerated shiver. Oh, Julian, it is so cold. How do you endure such suffering? Julian gave her a flat look. All right now, you're just being mean, Lyra laughed. The ship sat just as they had left it, partially buried in snow, its surface faintly illuminated by the stars above. Lyra wasted no time kneeling beside the panel she had opened earlier and attaching the newly constructed device to the ship's exterior. The wires sparked faintly as they connected, and the ship let out a low mechanical thrum. Julian stepped back. That sounded promising. Lara's violet eyes gleamed in the darkness. It is working. The energy relay pulsed, its glow intensifying as power surged into the ship's core. The hull seemed to ripple, shifting slightly as if responding to the influx of energy. A moment later, a soft chime echoed from within. Lyra exhaled. Reinitialization sequence engaged. Julian frowned. And that means? Lyra stood. It means we wait. Julian glanced at the ship. For how long? Lyra shrugged. Possibly hours, possibly minutes. Julian sighed. Fantastic. I love vague time estimates. Lyra smirked. Would you like me to provide an unnecessary countdown to make you feel better? Julian crossed his arms. You are way too good at sarcasm for an alien. Lyra only smiled. Minutes stretched into an hour. The ship continued its quiet hum, occasional flickers of light dancing across its surface. Julian sat on a nearby rock, pulling his coat tighter around himself, while Lara remained standing watching the ship with an unreadable expression. Julian glanced up at her. So if this thing starts working again, what happens next? Lara didn't answer immediately. For the first time since meeting her, she hesitated. Then I leave, she said finally. Julian frowned. He wasn't sure why, but the answer didn't sit right with him. He looked away, kicking at the snow. Right. Makes sense. Lyra studied him for a moment, then softly, she said, you have been kind to me, Julian. Julian forced a chuckle. Yeah, well, I also have a strong survival instinct, helping the alien with the broken spaceship seems smarter than making her angry. Lara's lips twitched. Reasonable assessment. They fell into silence again, the distant wind the only sound, and then the ship's glow brightened. Lara inhaled sharply. It's working. Julian stood. So this is it, huh? Lara turned to him, and for the first time something in her expression softened. Not quite yet. Julian swallowed. He wasn't sure if that made him relieved or just more confused. The ship pulsed with life, its metallic skin shifting with soft waves of energy that rippled outward in mesmerizing patterns. Julian took a cautious step back, squinting as the lights along the hall flickered like a machine coming out of a long cold sleep. Okay, he muttered, rubbing his hands together. So, what happens now? Does it transform, start levitating, sprout legs, and do a little dance? Lara crouched near the ship's control panel, shot him a sideways glance. Number, but if it did, that would be unfortunate. Why? Because my ship weighs approximately 50,000 kg. If it were to sprout legs and dance, I suspect the results would be catastrophic for this landscape, and also you. Julian blinked. I think I liked it better when you didn't understand sarcasm. Lyra smirked, turning her attention back to the controls. Her fingers hovered over the ship's exposed circuitry, glowing lines trailing up her skin as she interfaced with the ship directly. For a moment, her expression became unreadable, focused, distant, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Julian rubbed the back of his neck. He should have been relieved that things were working. This whole bizarre adventure had started with a half-frozen alien woman on his doorstep, and now, after salvaging parts, rigging a power relay, and making enough bad jokes to last a lifetime, she was about to fly off into the stars where she belonged. So why did that thought sit so weirdly in his chest? He shook it off, shoving his hands into his pockets. So how long until takeoff? Lyra exhaled slowly. Not yet. The core is stable, but the navigational matrix is still offline. I must realign the quantum lattice manually. Julian made a thoughtful noise. Yep, of course, realign the old quantum lattice. Classic problem, happens to me all the time. Lara gave a look before returning to her work. A moment later, the ship emitted a low chime, followed by a series of shifting panels as part of the hull unfolded. Julian tensed instinctively, but Lara remained calm, stepping forward as an entryway materialized before them. The interior of the ship was sleek and smooth its walls shifting with iridescent patterns of energy. Julian whistled. Okay, that's definitely cooler than my truck. Lara gestured for him too. Follow, come, I may require assistance. Julian hesitated. With what exactly? Because I should warn you, if your spaceship needs a tune-up, my mechanical skills are basically limited to smacking things until they work. Lasara raised an eyebrow. Duly noted. Fortunately, this requires no smacking. Julian sighed, dramatically disappointing, but okay. He followed her inside. The ship's interior was surprisingly comfortable. Julian had been expecting something cold and sterile, maybe some shiny control panels, a few ominous blinking lights, and a chair that looked like it belonged in a villain's lair. Instead, the space was filled with a soft ambient glow, the walls subtly shifting to accommodate their presence. There were seats that looked cushy enough to take a nap in, and the air smelled faintly of something floral. Julian sniffed. Is that lavender? Lyra glanced at him, mildly amused. You have a keen nose. The ship adjusts the atmosphere to be more comfortable for its occupants. Julian ran a hand over one of the smooth surfaces, and here I thought all spaceships were supposed to be depressing metal death traps. This is actually kind of nice. Lyra made a small pleased sound as she moved toward the main control console. I am glad you approve. Julian smirked. Oh, absolutely. If I had a spaceship like this, I'd just fly around all day drinking coffee and avoiding responsibility. Lyra's fingers moved swiftly over the glowing interface. Tempting, but interstellar travel requires a bit more effort than that. Julian sighed dramatically. Yeah, got to realign the quantum LCE and all that nonsense. Lyra chuckled. For the next hour, Julian did his best to be useful, which mostly consisted of handing Lara tools he didn't understand and pressing buttons she assured him wouldn't eject them into the void. The ship system slowly came back online, panels flickering with strings of alien script that scrolled too fast for Julian to make sense of, so he said after a while, how much longer until your space-worthy? Lasara exhaled. Soon. The primary systems are responding well. If all goes as expected, I should be able to leave by morning. Julian stared at the control panel, pretending that news didn't bother him. Right morning. Lyra glancing at him. You are troubled. Julian scoffed. What number? I mean, come on, we always knew this was temporary. You get your ship working, you fly off into space, and I go back to my normal quiet life. Lyra tilted her head. Is that truly what you want? Julian hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer that. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I don't know, it's not like I thought we were going to start a space road trip or anything, but I mean, it's been nice having someone around, even if that someone is a slightly smug, caffeine-destroying alien with suspiciously good sarcasm skills. Lara's lips curved a glowing review. Julian chuckled. Yeah, just don't put it on. A resumed silence settled between them, not awkward but weighted. LRA finally turned back to the console. I still owe you a reward. Julian rolled his eyes. You really don't have to, but I want to. Laser's voice was quiet but firm. She turned back to him, something unreadable in her violet eyes. And it is not something I give lightly. Julian frowned. Okay, now you're being mysterious on purpose. Lara stepped closer. Trust me. Julian sighed. All right, fine, but if your idea of a reward involves mind-melting knowledge of the universe, I'd like to request something a little less brain-breaking, maybe a gift card. Lyra laughed. Not quite. And then with an air of finality, she placed a hand over his chest, right above his heart. A pulsive energy surged through him, warm and electric, like the feeling of stepping into sunlight after a long, cold night. The ship seemed to respond in kind, its lights brightening in waves that pulsed outward. Julian inhaled sharply. Okay, that's new. Lunk voice was soft. This is only the beginning. Julian swallowed. He had a feeling she was right. Julian sat on the floor of the spaceship, blinking rapidly as the strange warmth that had surged through his chest settled into something quieter, like an ember glowing in his ribcage. He placed a hand over the spot where Lara had touched him, half expecting to feel some kind of change, maybe a new heartbeat, maybe an extra lung, something. Instead, he just felt like himself, which, given the dramatic energy pulse, seemed almost disappointing. He looked up at Lara, who was watching him with an amused expression, her violet eyes glinting under the soft ambient glow of the ship's interior. So he said, tilting his head, do I get superpowers now, or is this One of those slow-burn transformations where I wake up in 3 days and suddenly have laser vision. Lars smirked. It is not a transformation, it is a gift. Julian squinted at her. That's what people say. Right before they give you a really ugly sweater and expect you to wear it. Lara chuckled. I assure you this is more useful than a sweater. Julian raised an eyebrow. Debatable. Sweaters are very useful in winter. Lyra shook her head with a small exasperated sigh, then gestured for him to stand. Come, let us test it. Julian got to his feet, stretching. Experiment. Mentally he still felt normal except for the strange lingering warmth beneath his sternum. All right, hit me with it. What did you do? Lara tilted her head, considering. How are your senses? Julian frowned. I feel fine. Wait. He turned his head slightly, suddenly noticing a hum in the air he hadn't been aware of before. It was faint but constant, like standing near a power line. Okay, that's new. What is that? The ship's energy field. You can sense it now. Julian blinked. That's weirdly cool. He focused on it for a second, then frowned. Wait, does this mean I'm going to start hearing radio signals because I don't want to be woken up at 3 in the morning by alien talk shows? Lyra smiled. Unlikely, but there is more. Julian rubbed his hands together. All right, let's see what else I can do. Can I lift things with my mind, predict the future, finally understand tax law? Lara rolled her eyes but gestured toward the ship's console. Try to focus on it, not with your eyes, with your mind. Julian narrowed his eyes. That sounds like something a Jedi would say. Lara merely waited. Julian exhaled, then stared at the console. He felt ridiculous. What was he supposed to do? Just think at it really hard. Still, he gave it a shot, concentrating on the smooth, glowing panel for a moment. Nothing happened, then a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible shimmer in the air around the controls. Julian's breath caught. Wait, did I? The console beeped softly. Julian stumbled backward. Whoa, okay, that was not a coincidence. Right, tell me that wasn't a coincidence. Lyra grinned. It was not. Julian pointed at hair. All right, so now I definitely have space powers. Lyra tilted her head. A connection, not powers. You are now attuned to the ship's energy, to the technology that surrounds you. It will take time to fully understand it, but you are already adapting quickly. Julian let out a low whistle. So what? I'm part spaceship now. I'm some kind of what's the word? A cyborg. Lara's lips quirked. No mechanical parts were added. You are merely more than you were before. Julian stared at his hands. I don't know if I should be excited or terrified. Lyra considered this. Perhaps both. Julian exhaled. Great, super reassuring. She chuckled, but there was something softer in her expression. Now you have been kind to me, Julian. I wish to give you something in return, something meaningful. Julian met her gaze. Despite all the sarcasm, all the jokes, he could feel the sincerity behind her words, and suddenly that ember in his chest didn't feel so foreign anymore. He swallowed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, well, I guess I should say thanks, even if I still don't fully understand what's happening. Lyra nodded. You will in time. Julian sighed. You keep saying that, but what if I accidentally open a wormhole while making coffee? Lyra smirked. Then you will have a very interesting morning. Julia groaned. Fantastic. The rest of the night was spent testing his newfound connection, which mostly involved Julian trying very hard not to break anything. It turned out he could sense more than just the ship's energy. He could feel the subtle currents in the air, the shifts in temperature, even the hum of the stars beyond the hull. It was overwhelming at first, like his brain had been given a whole new set of senses it didn't quite know how to process. By the time exhaustion finally hit him, he was sprawled on one of the ship's strangely comfortable chairs, his head tilted back as he stared at the softly glowing ceiling. So he muttered, half delirious with fatigue, you're leaving tomorrow? Lyra was quiet for a moment before she answered, yes. Julian exhaled through his nose. Yeah, right, of course. She watched him carefully. Do you wish for me to stay? Julian hesitated. He wanted to say no, that he was fine, that this had all been fun and weird, and now it was time to go back to normal life, but normal life suddenly felt small in comparison to everything he had experienced. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't want you to go, but I get it. You have a life out there. You don't belong here. Lyra studied him, then reached out, placing a hand lightly over his chest. Again the warmth flared, comforting this time. Perhaps, she said softly, you do not belong here either. Julian froze her. Words settled deep, curling around something inside him he hadn't even realized was restless. Lara pulled her hand back. Rest, Julian. Tomorrow we will see where fate takes us. Julian swallowed. He had a feeling his life was about to change forever. Julian stood at the threshold of the spaceship, staring out at the familiar world he had once called home. The night sky stretched above him, impossibly vast, filled with stars that now felt closer than they ever had before. The cold wind whispered across his skin, carrying the distant sounds of his old life, the rustling trees, the hum of the city far beyond the hills. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. Behind him, Lazarus stood at the controls, her long ears twitching slightly as she watched him. Her violet eyes, filled with a quiet understanding, held none of the urgency she had carried when they first met. Now there was only patience. You are hesitating, she observed. Julian exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. Well, yeah, I mean, this is kind of a big deal, life-changing decisions and all that. Lyra stepped forward, her boots clicking softly against the metallic floor. You do not have to decide tonight. Julian turned to her, arching an eyebrow. No offense, but if I wake up tomorrow and see your ship flying off without me, I'm going to be really mad. She smirked. Then you should decide tonight, he groaned. I walked into that one. Lyra simply waited. She had never pressured him, never tried to force him into anything. That somehow made it harder, because this wasn't just about escaping the mundane, about running away from a life that had suddenly felt too small. It was about stepping into something unknown, something bigger, stranger, maybe even dangerous. But wasn't that the point? Julian ran a hand through his hair. Let's say I come with you. You. What exactly am I signing up for? Intergalactic politics, smuggling, space tourism. Lyra crossed her arms. You will see wonders beyond anything you have imagine. Julian squinted. That sounds like something a travel brochure would say. She chuckled. You will learn, grow. You will understand your connection to the universe in ways you never thought possible. Julian nodded slowly. And also probably almost die if a few times right. Lara tilted her head. Likely. Julian sighed dramatically. Great, fantastic love. That silence settled between them for a moment. Then Lyra spoke softer this time. I cannot promise you safety, Julian, but I can promise you purpose. That did it. Julian let out a long breath, glancing one last time at the landscape outside the old world, his old life. Then he turned away from it. Well, he said, cracking his knuckles, let's go see some wonders. Lyra smiled. The transition from Earth to the stars was disorienting, but exhilarating. The ship lifted off in a smooth, almost dreamlike ascent, and within moments the world below shrank into nothingness. Julian pressed his hands against the cold glass of the viewport, his breath catching as the sky darkened into the infinite black of space. Stars stretched around them in every direction, more brilliant than he had ever seen. All right, he murmured, I got to admit, this is pretty cool. Lasara stood beside him, watching with quiet amusement. You have not seen anything yet. Julian turned to her. So where are we headed first? Space. Vegas, a planet made entirely of waterfalls. Please tell me there's a planet made entirely of waterfalls. Lara smirked. There is a moon of a Rex 4 with cascading ice rivers. It is quite beautiful. Julian pointed at her. See, this is why I came along. She chuckled and turned to the control panel, inputting coordinates. We will make a few stops before reaching my home world. You should become accustomed to space travel before anything more intense. Julian raised an eyebrow. Define intense. Lisa didn't answer, which was not reassuring. Days, or possibly weeks, blurred together as Julian adjusted to life among the stars. Space travel was a strange mix of breathtaking and tedious. For every moment of awe, there were long stretches of downtime where he found himself playing intergalactic chess with the ship's AI, which was really bad at it, or trying to convince Lara to teach him how to pilot. You are not ready, she said repeatedly. But there were also the wonders. He saw a nebula up close, its swirling colors shifting like a living painting. He walked on the surface of a low-gravity moon, laughing as he bounced higher than physics should have allowed. He tasted alien fruit that made his tongue feel like it was vibrating. Lara had neglected to warn him about that, and through it all he felt himself changing. He was learning to use his connection to the ship, sensing its systems in ways he never thought possible. He was growing accustomed to the rhythm of the universe beyond Earth, no longer feeling like an outsider in a world too vast for him to understand. He belonged one night if time Even worked that way in space, Julian found himself staring out at the stars again, the quiet hum of the ship filling the air around him. Lysara approached, standing beside him. You have adjusted it. Well, she said. Julian smirked. Was there ever any doubt? She raised an eyebrow. He sighed. Okay, fine, there might have been some doubt, but I think I'm getting the hang of it. Lara nodded. Good, you will need to. Julian frowned. You keep saying stuff like that, and it's very ominous. She hesitated, then looked at him seriously. The universe is not always kind, Julian. There are dangers, conflicts, things that will test you. Julian held her gaze. Yeah, well, I figure as long as I have a good co-pilot, I'll be fine. Lyra tilted her head. Co-pilot? Julian grinned. Listen, I'm not saying I should fly the ship yet, but you could let me push a few buttons, maybe, just the non-explosive ones. Lyra rolled her eyes. We will discuss this later. Julian leaned back against the wall, exhaling. You know, for what it's worth, I think I made the right choice. Lyra glanced at him. I think so too. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the endless expanse before them. Then Julian smirked. So about that ice waterfall moon? Lyra sighed. I am beginning to regret this. Julian grinned. Too late, you're stuck with me now. And as the ship glided forward, leaving behind the last traces of his old life, Julian knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The end.